few more callers come in. But this is Dan Spooler. I am the co-chair of the North Carolina Blockchain Initiative. And I, along with my three co-chairs, Eric Porper and Farouk Oxenden, want to thank you and welcome you to our second in a series of webinars, and hope that you will find this presentation useful and informative. As a brief introduction, the North Carolina Blockchain Initiative was founded last summer on July 2nd, 2019 by Lieutenant Governor. He announced, Dan Forrest announced the formation of this task force with the designated goal of studying, examining, and evaluating the unique attributes and use cases behind blockchain technology, virtual assets, smart contracts, and digital tokens. Our task force is appointed, and it's comprised of several diverse and exceptionally knowledgeable industry leaders and esteemed members from academia and the business community. And we're very humbled and appreciate their contributions and support. Today, we're pleased to announce that we have the CEO of Ownum Shane Bigelow, the CEO of Ownum, and then Mr. Randy Cole, the Executive Vice President and Chief Solutions Officer of Ownum, to do a presentation on digital motor vehicle titles and how they are going to explain how it's a nearly perfect blockchain use case. Ownum is a company that Ownum builds companies that digitize paper-based processes, creates a digital asset, and record that asset to a blockchain. And one of these Ownum companies is CHAMPtitles, and that's one of the topics we're going to be covering today. So without further ado, let me introduce to you Shane and Randy.
Great. Good morning. Thank you, everyone, for your time. This is Shane Bigelow, and as mentioned, Randy Cole is on the line as well. Dan, would you like me to give a brief background of our overview of Odom?
I would like that. Yeah, I think that'd be very beneficial to the attendees and history, perhaps, as well.
Super. So Ownum is Ownum is a holding company, and underneath Ownum, we create other companies that focus on digitizing vehicle records. So hopefully everyone can still hear me. It's got a weird message on Zoom. So
yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. The four companies that you see on your screen, if you happen to be logged in online, are CHAMPtitles, which is what we'll be talking about today, which is digitizing vehicle titles. Vital Chain, which is digitizing birth and death certificates. DigiCredits, which digitizes transferable tax credits. And Tech Tags, which actually takes information from vehicles and links it back to the title. But the reason that Ownum was built and came up with the structure is that Bernie Moreno, our chairman, and I, when we started the company, we had this belief that we had this messed up gene that made us think we could possibly help make government a little bit more efficient and make business benefit from that. And so we decided that since neither of us were going to run for office anytime soon, the thought would be, how can we create companies that help processes inside of government that right now could use some updating and would ultimately help everyone inside of government do their job better and help the constituents benefit from the technology we're creating. So in the case of titles, as you know, titles are a state-by-state issue, and we're talking specifically about vehicle titles, not land titles. And Bernie happened to come from the automotive retail space. I had spent some time in technology with a handful of companies and then on Wall Street as well, and recognized that the problem with titles was that the paper actually slowed down the ecosystem. It slowed down the ability for dealers to transact. It slowed down the ability for insurers to get a car sold. Once it's salvaged, it slowed down the ability for lenders to have a lien release and then ultimately relinquish the title to the owner of the car at the end of a loan. And it just became a cumbersome process, but one that if was taken out of the paper world and moved into the paperless or digital world, would truly unleash a lot of economic benefit for the ecosystem and a lot of efficiency for the users. So we set out to create this, and we have now created a path for a completely paperless vehicle titling process. and we're in the process of rolling it out in several states. So why don't I stop and pause and let Randy take over from here?
Thanks, Shane. Again, echoing what Shane said, it's a pleasure to be here, be a part of this. It is always exciting when a state like North Carolina has the foresight to try to lay a framework and a groundwork, a foundation for policy making, for evaluating blockchain use cases and how a state will utilize blockchain. So you guys have put together a great group to look at that. I did listen in on the call you had, the kind of blockchain 101 call, and what Dan and Eric asked us to do is reveal, again, what we think is one of those practically perfect blockchain use cases, and I'll try to explain why as we go through the presentation. There aren't a ton of slides, so it's only 9 or 10 slides, so we'll discuss those as we go through. But I would hope that you send Dan a question, and Dan, if you would moderate or curate as we go through this. I'll focus on the presentation, and Shane and I are both available throughout the course of the presentation to answer questions. The content we have is only 30-35 minutes or so. So with the 45 minutes allotted to this, we are expecting some Q&A, which as you have it, feel free to bring up.
Yeah, and Randy, actually, I'd like to tell everyone in the audience as well, as Randy pointed out, if you have questions, please use the chat there to flag and ask it, and I'll unmute you. And we hope to have some good active dialogue throughout the presentation, and then we'll conclude with the Q&A as well. So we want to provide ample enough time for questions, and I'm sure there'll be several. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. So as you can see from this slide, for those of you who are online, we purposely created what I think is one of the worst PowerPoint slides in history, because it's almost impossible to read or follow. And I think that's the whole point of a paper-based process, whether it's card titling or other paper-based processes. Even if you make some of it electronic, in most cases, a centralized database or an electronic system either mirrors the existing process, and you've just replaced fields and forms online with the same things that were created in paper, or you have backup paper documents to verify or validate that information that's been put into a system. Most recently, the US DOT through NHTSA created a federal standard for eliminating one of the pieces of paper that had stopped, that slowed down the digital economy with vehicle ownership and car sales, which was the electronic odometer statement, and the ability for states to move forward with that. We're very proud of the fact that we worked with the White House and US DOT in the crafting of that standard. If anybody wants to read it, I'm sure Dan or Eric can forward you a link, but it is 132 pages. But important within that is the word blockchain. And blockchain is a recognized technology for validating the people, the vehicles, the process involved, the mileage, so that piece of paper, which is the only federal part of this, it is, as Shane said, a state function across the country. We work very closely with AMVA, the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, as we're rolling out this technology. But if you see right there in the center of the screen, the odometer disclosure is one federal piece of paper required through that process. But again, no matter who the participant is, from auto manufacturers, the dealers, the insurance industry, auto lenders, and we'll talk more about those parties and the benefits as we work our way through. But everyone has volumes of paper, some amount of storage, mailing, and a lack of validation through the process. It's a very linear process, and any mistake that happens with a piece of that paper, or as someone works through the titling process, you know, it is a cumbersome process at some point downstream. When somebody finds a problem, they've got to go all the way back to where that mistake was made, find the parties again, and try to work forward. And this slide we're much more proud of than the last slide. We often talk that it's the business process reengineering or the services that are part of this process that are more important than the technology behind it. Technology has moved rapidly and will continue to move rapidly over the coming years and decades. The underlying technology of blockchain and a distributed ledger technology provides great benefits for the problems we are solving here, but it's also changing the process that makes the big improvement. And what we really talk about when we talk about changing the process is each of these parties through Hyperledger Fabric, and it can be other blockchains, but they are linked through channels so that each of the participants can verify and validate data before submission. The immutable record created by blockchain, that encrypted hash, the creation of an immutable record helps reduce fraud. It ensures parties that their part of the transaction or their information that's going on to a title is sealed. And for each of these parties, that's a significant improvement than just passing a piece of paper or, again, entering information into an electronic database without the other part of that party being able to verify and validate it. So when we created CHAMPtitles, a big part of the beauty is just starting on the left side of the screen. A dealer and a buyer are able to verify their information to, again, make sure the data it's being put into a title application, this title submission itself, is accurate and has been verified. By the same token, lenders are able to put their information in, linked by VIN, buyer information, to make sure a lien is properly placed. And it can happen in real time. It's not something being mailed or put on somebody's desk. Instead, it can happen in almost real time through the use of blockchain and through the workflow that we've embedded in our system to allow that to happen. The same way with insurers. Some states, South Carolina being one, other states have an electronic proof of insurance. In that case, we have the technology enabled to allow an insurer to verify the insurance on a vehicle prior to titling or registration. Other states don't have that. So again, a big part of what we've done with the creation of a national platform is the ability to turn these features or functionalities on and off by state based on their statutory authority, their policies, and their preferences, and the bottom as a title issuing authority. So the system itself can be customized, not just a commercial for this, but thinking through, again, how the process itself can change in underlying technology like blockchain and a distributed ledger can allow these types of participation to happen. Previously, no state, many states do have electronic lien and title, ELT, and some have electronic registration and title. But the ability for each of these parties to participate and protect their own data prior to submission, validate the information, wasn't possible through the creation of a centralized, say, centralized state database. Instead, that can happen outside of those systems and then interact with an existing state's titling system or as a new titling system is created. The example we've used is similar to TurboTax. And the reason we bring up TurboTax is over 20 some years ago, the IRS enabled companies to electronically perform the services related to the submission of a personal income tax return. But believe it or not, the IRS still utilizes an IBM mainframe that's been in operation for over 50 years, related to all of those millions of tax returns that come in. But they created an electronic gateway that today 70 different companies perform those services. And the reason to bring it up is the services, the changing of the process means better validated tax returns. And the TurboTax example I'm using, and I use TurboTax against over 70 companies provide those services, but it's what I use and it's the largest market share that's out there. But the IRS found that the error rate on tax returns dropped from 20% to less than 1% because TurboTax not only allows for the electronic submission, they've changed the process. Instead of stacks of paper and lots of documents, they walk you through the process and ask you questions about your life that guide how a tax return is included, maximizing refunds for their customers and minimizing the errors that are submitted to the IRS with those tax returns. So it's focusing on the business process at the dealership, at the buyer, the lenders, insurers, and the title issuing authority. In insurance, one of the things in the couple years we've been working on this is in insurance, it's not just that electronic proof of insurance, but for insurers, their biggest pain point is the salvage side of this. And Shane has been working very closely with insurers and the salvage companies. Shane, I don't know if you want to pick up and talk briefly about salvage and the amount of value and pain that's there, but if not, I can briefly run through it.
No, I'm happy to. So, one of the interesting things we uncovered as we dug deeper and deeper into this was that there's no point at which there's a huge queue of people standing around saying, hey, titles are expensive, titles are my number one problem. There's no line item on anyone's cash flow statement that says title expense, because the expense and the problems with titles are spread throughout so many different arenas within the ecosystem that it just winds up being a cost that the ecosystem picks up, but unfortunately that gets passed through to consumers. And salvage and insurance is a perfect example. So when a car is totaled in a bad accident, it's obviously one of the worst experiences a consumer could have. That vehicle is picked up and taken to a salvage yard. And the salvage yard then has to retitle the vehicle on behalf of the insurer. So they have a power of attorney, so piece of paper, that allows them to retitle the car from the consumer, or more than likely the lender that had the loan on the car, over to the consumer, then from the consumer to the insurance company, and the insurance company ultimately to the parts buyer. And that transaction, elicits a number of statutory fees for every state, which remain intact fully with anything that we're doing, of course. No fee degradation whatsoever. But the time is the issue. The average amount of time that a car will sit in a salvage yard is just over 100 days. And that car, from the moment it's in the accident till the moment it gets sold, is depreciating. That depreciation expense and the storage expense, then the mailing expense of the title and the paper associated with it, all of that hits the insurer's expense column, and those expenses are passed through ultimately in the form of higher rates for consumers. And if you think about it, the sort of crazy issue is that most of that 100 days is spent waiting on the title. So if we can speed that up, we can create a much more efficient transaction for the ecosystem, a better experience for the consumer who's just had sort of a traumatic moment in their life with their vehicle getting totaled, and retain all the fees that the state would otherwise have gathered. It just happens a lot faster. The truly sort of big moment for salvage occurred about 5 years ago, when the telemetry and computers in cars got so advanced that now even minor accidents create a total loss scenario. So these salvage yards are literally flowing over with cars. They are full in most cases, and they have to cycle through them as quickly as possible. And the problem is that any of those expenses that they incur, that they ultimately charge the insurance carriers then ultimately charge the consumer. And all of this is for the title. And so if we can help that process, we know that ultimately the consumer will experience lower rates. They'll have a better experience with the government agency that's touching the titles. and ultimately will help abate what is going to be a continually growing issue as telemetry and computers in cars result in more and more total loss vehicles. And again, that all sort of started 5 years ago when the growth went exponential in that space. It was, it literally has grown 80% in the last 5 years. So let me pause there and let Randy take back over.
Yeah, sure. I'll finish that point, and then Dan, if there are any questions at this point, we do have more to cover to get into a little more details around it. But if you think about it, the average age of a totaled vehicle used to be 10 or 11 years because the depreciation had to get to the point that it wasn't worth making the repairs, or the amount of damage had to be so bad. So to Shane's point, that age of car is dropping. Newer and newer cars are getting totaled, which have higher and higher value because of the very high cost of these repairs. And again, it doesn't have to be a lot of physical damage, but the right hit at the right way creates the total loss. Are there questions, Dan? Is there anybody commenting yet?
Yeah, does anybody have any questions right now? It's a great point, actually. Happy to entertain any.
I have a quick question. I'm curious if you're going to get to this later on, please let me know, if you can briefly explain what kind of regulatory hurdles you faced on the state and federal level.
Sure. So the first thing, it was certainly the odometer statement, being the only federal piece of paper that inserts itself into the vehicle titling process on a state-by-state basis. So we were successful, as Randy mentioned, working with the White House and Department of Transportation on having that language adjusted so that it could be done in electronic form. No longer is a wet signature required. And they even, in their report, or in their new guidelines rather, mentioned that blockchain was an acceptable path for this to occur. So that was a big win, certainly for the totality of the industry, and we're happy to be a part of it. That was at a federal level. At a state level, it truly is state specific. E-sign allowed for electronic signatures, obviously, across the country. But some states have taken different approaches around whether or not blockchain counts for e-sign. So Ohio, where we're based, they passed a law that clarified that, in fact, blockchain is something that is a valid form of signature, and that blockchain technology didn't need any sort of special exception across any agency or any department in order to be properly deployed. So the nice thing is that legislation has been copied now in 13 different states, and in working with Chamber of Digital Commerce and what Dan represents, they've been very helpful in basically trying to educate states to say don't over legislate this. So I'll give one example where Vermont has taken the approach of chronicling out every appropriate use of blockchain. Well, this is kind of a difficult thing for any enterprise to work with, because you basically have to have them write down when your use of blockchain is allowed in their state. That's a really tough path for a state to go down, because the analogy I use in talking to different state governments around the country is, if you're hiring KPMG or Accenture or Deloitte or some consulting firm, doesn't matter if they're big or small, I suppose, and they're solving a problem for you, do you ask what type of database they're using? And the answer is no. I said, so why are we concerned with whether or not we're using blockchain or just solving a problem? Right? The problem we're solving is that paper in the titling space is a drag on the ecosystem and a drag on government. It's how do we make it paperless? And Ohio has done a great job in really helping to define that and say this isn't really about blockchain. It's about going paperless. And let's not let the fact that blockchain is a viable path to solve this problem make us have to, dig too deep in those weeds. So, the problems have, in terms of legislatively speaking, have been when states get too specific and aren't just willing to sort of say, yes, this is a viable technology, and there's no reason to be scared of it, sort of thing. Does that help?
On that point, Shane, this is Dan. Are there any states that stand out? Just because I know there's some North Carolina decision makers on this call. Are there any states that have stood out to you as being a little more friendly, regulatorily speaking, when it comes to issues with the DMV and DOT?
Ohio, Colorado, Utah, West Virginia, Texas, to some extent Arizona, have all been. Oklahoma has been starting to move in that direction. Certainly, what you all are doing in North Carolina is a great sign. And basically the heat map of who is friendlier and not sort of aligns to which states are have digital government as a priority. So if that is a priority in a state, typically we see that they're very open to blockchain and don't get sort of in the weeds on, well, how does it work? What does it do? It just matters what it does, as opposed to how does it work? Because blockchain is at its heart, all blockchain is just a really sophisticated ledger, and it's cryptographically secure, so it's super secure, and it's immutable, and it's transparent to the owners of it. And there's two types of blockchains. There's permissionless blockchain, like cryptocurrency, and then there's permissioned. And permissioned is something that would be deployed in this scenario where the stakeholders that are allowed to participate in this blockchain are controlled, so that they're simply part of the title ecosystem. So when you have that, you've got a really secure path towards allowing the ledger to keep track of who owns what. And that makes it as Randy's title said, a nearly perfect use case for blockchain.
Good morning, everybody. This is
one more question. Okay.
Yeah, this is Farouk Occitan, one of the co-chairs. Again, thank you so much to Ownum for being with us and all the attendees. I have a sort of a general question. I mean, this is a fascinating use case, obviously, and something we've been promoting within North Carolina, looking for effective use cases. But in a more general sense, using these belted systems, these blockchain belted systems, is there another target in sight beyond car titles that you yourself think are the most appropriate next step? Are you guys going down the path to find another solution to a problem, or would you, think of another state agency environment or at the federal level that would be a great target to apply this technology to, and what that environment would be, in your opinion?
Yeah, absolutely. So the chassis we built, what we call the belted system, which is Blockchain Encrypted Ledger that's executable and distributed. The reason we came up with that, little inside baseball, is that whenever we go into a meeting and say blockchain 2 years ago when we started the company, people would immediately go down a rat hole of cryptocurrency. And we realized that the word was actually causing a problem from a sales perspective. So again, a lot of inside baseball here, but we like to be transparent. So we came up with the acronym BELTED because it actually stopped people from getting worried about blockchain, and they got them more focused on the words, that it's executable, distributed, secure, all of the things, and it's a ledger. It just made it a lot clearer for people. So with that chassis in hand, car titles is certainly the first place that we've gone after. The obvious path after that is boats and planes and ATVs and other things, but put those all into the vehicle category. But the thing we're most excited about now is our second company, Vital Chain, which focuses on the digitization of birth and death certificates. We found that this is a real problem for most states. In Ohio, just airing the dirty laundry of the state we live in. The joke in Ohio is that it takes 6 months to die. So from the point at which you actually die to the point at which all of the different entities, whether it be pension funds, social welfare programs, financial firms and others, it literally is 6 months until everyone's figured out that you're dead. So benefits pay out, income streams continue that shouldn't be continued. and there's an enormous expense on the death side. On the birth side, it's far more tragic, unfortunately. If you're not aware of the birth and the data behind it, and you're similarly not aware of the death, it's very hard to craft proper infant mortality programs, infant mortality abatement programs. So hospitals really struggle with how to get the data to understand if their infant mortality programs are working if they're not aware of all of the data around birth and death. And you'd think that this would be, a fairly straightforward process, but the reality is that it's highly complex because typically the issuance of birth certificates or death certificates is fragmented across a wide number of players in every state, and you just wind up not being able to synthesize the data in a useful way. So that is our next approach. We have a pilot going with a major hospital system around the birth side of things, which is really going to help them drive. It happens to be a state-owned medical system. So it's going to help them drive the mothers to come back for postnatal care, because now they have a path to have a digital dialogue with that customer who gave birth in their hospital, and it can drive them back to get that postnatal care, which has an enormous impact on the life quality for the child. It also has conveniently a federal benefit attached to it, in that there are federal programs that will pay hospitals that are, particularly in lower income neighborhoods, that are getting people to come back for postnatal care. And this all starts because they had a digital record of the birth, and they had a digital path towards communicating with that customer of theirs who gave birth in their hospital. So that's the second spot where we're headed, and we're really excited about it. And again, the chassis, the underlying belted chassis, is what enables us to go after each of these subsectors. But we're very cautious about dipping our toe into too many places. We are still a young company. We've been successful in raising a reasonable amount of capital from the venture community. So we're excited about that, but capital is finite. So we are careful about what areas we go into. We're not a consulting firm. We look for these opportunities where there's a problem within government, where we can solve it for the ecosystem and drive a benefit back to the agencies and departments as well, while not charging the government, by the way. It's very important to indicate that we are not vendors to the states. We are simply, like TurboTax, like that example, we are simply providing a way to improve a process while enabling the state to keep their costs very low in managing their current systems. We're just looking for a way to access those systems through some sort of data access layer, again, using the TurboTax analogy.
Dan, if we're ready to pick up again, I just want to explain a few more characteristics, both of the way we envision the system, but then how that value actually happens. And I think we can do that pretty quickly and get back to Q&A. But on the slide you see now, the screen, you see the difference between the words portal, application, and gateway. And in each of those cases, for each of those parties, the system itself, and we think, again, other blockchain applications, for smaller parties, we have a portal, like an existing online form where you can hand enter data. But there can also be a gateway to use an API for integrating with large existing systems, like or an application. In the case of lien management, right? Most banks of any size have sophisticated loan management systems, FIS and other providers. We can integrate directly with those. Again, in each of these cases where the ecosystem has another database or another system where they're processing parts of this data, we can create the flows for that to flow into ours. We've explained most of what's on this slide, but you do see at the bottom of this secure title exchange protocol, a great additional benefit is, as any state digitizes this information, the ability to pass that information to another state when either a car is sold, a vehicle is sold into another state between dealerships, or when a person moves, right? Millions of people move across state lines every year. North Carolina has seen significant growth in the past couple decades. And a problem for states where people are leaving is orphaned records, where they don't get a notification that somebody has left. So there's still a registration and title in place. But more importantly, for a state where someone is moving, you want that new vehicle titled, both related to safety, emissions, taxes and fees, vehicle inspections that all need to occur. We can enable through STEP the ability for that digital information, the virtual information, to pass as the physical presence of a person moves from one state to another. We actually were in one state that has had a really high influx of population growth, and they actually have state troopers. I won't mention the state, but they have state troopers patrolling the parking lots of large companies, of large office parks, because there's a high volume of out-of-state plates where people are maintaining their previous registration, their previous titling, and those vehicles aren't coming into their systems yet. At the bottom right corner, you see the promotes safety through accurate manufacturer recall. Again, if you think back to what I talked about with the paper process, and what that meant, more than anything, for the consumer, it's cumbersome too. We've talked a lot about all the business benefits, but the example I would use is my own. My wife and I had a 2006 Jeep Grand Cherokee that had 257,000 miles on it. We were very proud of the fact that we had driven the equivalent of driving to the moon and were returning back. But it just started to have more functional problems. Was not a total loss, but it wasn't a good economic choice to continue to put money into a vehicle that was 12 years old and had that much miles on it. The reason we went to sell that vehicle and trade it in, when we traded it in, went back to that bottom corner, we found out from the dealership it had 3 recalls on it. A big part of it is that title had my wife's maiden name. It had her address where she lived 3 addresses ago, not our current address. The only thing that was right on the title was the VIN number and the make and model of the car. Still showed a lien that had been paid off years before because we had a separate lien release letter, but we had never gone in because, quite honestly, the 3 or 4 hours to pack up, go to the title office, stand in line, make sure you have all the right paperwork to make all the right changes, and then pay for that new title was too big a burden. So the other analogy we've developed is the idea of an online boarding pass. Think of that title, if it were securely in your wallet and without having to go to a government office, you could make those updates, or a bank could update information about a lien holder and process that through the system and back to a state's titling system. How much more quickly and easily those updates would be made. So in our case, if along the lines when we got married or we moved, we could just on our cell phone make those updates and inform a state system that those updates had been made, we would have received those manufacturer recall notices. But instead, we had not, because we had the problem of the burden of going down and making that visit. So we, just like an online boarding pass, both for the airlines and for the consumers, has unlocked new capabilities, especially like the idea of the QR code. You can't get on the wrong airplane anymore because it flashes red or green when you present it. The old paper title was locked in a state of being right when it was printed, the same way an old airline ticket was right when it was first printed, or most right when it was printed. By making it digital, you can update it more easily, which then allows for more functionality, again, for the participants and for the consumers. What you see here is the idea of different types of titles that today exist in paper, but they can only exist in one place in a digital title system. And that QR code, when it's linked back to a state system, there's only one source of truth. There's only one source of authority, and that really can reduce the amount of fraud, the misuse, and efficiency by having that digital identity. And then again, once it's encrypted, safely secured in a digital wallet, that is so much different. When I speak publicly, I'll often ask how many people where their title is. And very often a large number of hands will go up, and because I'll say, is it at the bank? Is it locked away at home? How many of you is it in your glove box in the car? And people will just raise their hand. Well, if you're keeping your paper car title in your car, you're giving a car thief quick and easy action to take legal possession of your car by forging a signature and getting on with their life.
So we have a question actually that came in from one of our callers. So we couldn't type it in, but the email question asked about Ownum as a way of combating fraud, such as cars with a salvage title after flood damage. You know, this was a pretty big problem after hurricanes such as Katrina. Do you see this as a potential solution for combating activities like that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So, with our system, every state can maintain their view of when a vehicle is salvaged, right? So every state has a view on what is a salvageable event and what is not. And we can certainly control for having, 50 different variations of that. However, what's particularly useful is when people try to clean a title, they will often try to pass it through a state that has less rigor than another state. And so a classic example where we live is Kentucky has far less rigor than Ohio. And so if you had a hail damaged vehicle in Ohio and you retitle it in Kentucky, you get a clean title. And then if you sold it in Indiana, Indiana believes it's a clean title, even though it was technically a salvage title in Ohio. And there's no knowledge either with insurance underwriting at the bank, in Indiana's titling system held by the Department of Motor Vehicles. There's no knowledge that, in fact, this car was already salvaged once. And so it could even be innocently done. Someone could easily move between those three states because they share borders. However, it is a popular way to clean a title. In our world, if that title was deemed to be clean in Kentucky, they're entitled to do that. That's their state right to do that. But in the event that it gets retitled in Indiana, Indiana will have, because it's a blockchain system, it's transparent as to them that they can look on the blockchain through our UI, of course, and figure out that, oh, wait a minute, yes, it was clean in Kentucky, but it was salvage in Ohio. So it enables a path for them to say, nope, we're going to regard this as a salvage title or apply their state rules. But similarly, insurance companies, when they're doing underwriting, or banks, when they're doing lending, will want that same data. And eventually that ferrets out the fraud. The other side of fraud that it eliminates is that, title lending companies are across the street from each other for a reason. It's not because they all happen to be zoned into one particular geography within a small town. It's because typically title lenders will, unfortunately with usury rates, will often prey on those that are most in need of that capital. And in a paper system, it's not uncommon at all for people who are in that desperate need for capital to go to one title loan vendor, and then literally cross the street and get the same loan on the same asset, even though there's no more collateral available, because the title loan vendor is making their fees either way, provided that the money gets paid to them. But the problem is, of course, that there's often defaults, and then who owns the vehicle? And all of that is only possible because the paper can't catch up to the data of the loan being applied, or the lien being applied by that title loan operator. So all of that fraud, it can be eliminated as well. And, the preying on the poorest or most needy people in our society is also eliminated. So there is a great opportunity here to eliminate fraud because of the transparency associated with a blockchain system.
And the slide we have up just supports what Shane was just talking about. By integrating with other systems, we've talked most of the presentation about how this works within the vehicle title ecosystem of just those parties who are a part of a transaction. But when you look at the broader efforts that are out there in data sources, you can eliminate a lot of that fraud by having instantaneous connections to those systems that help provide some of that anti-fraud mechanism or our large national databases and compilers of data related to those things we've been talking about. So I hope those two parts of it answer that question. I see it's almost 10:45, Dan.
Yeah, I think this would be a great way to open up just to, if there are any remaining questions from the audience, we'd be happy to take them right now. Just let us know, and we'll unmute you. And if there are no, we'll give it a couple seconds here. Well, while we're waiting on these questions, I just want to thank, again, Shane and Randy from Ownum for this presentation today. This technology is going to undoubtedly become a transformational part of our everyday life. And I strongly encourage everybody on the line to connect with them, and we'd be happy to provide their contact information to learn more about Ownum and CHAMPtitles. But as the NCBI, we're going to continue to host these industry webinars as a way to showcase these use cases and to educate our state leadership, policymakers, and the public at large about the promises of digitization and blockchain-based technologies. Because the more prepared we can be as a state and community, the more benefits the public will see collectively from fostering this innovation. So again, thank you for everybody for tuning in. And I want to also, again, thank the Office of the Lieutenant Governor for encouraging these developments and recommendations as they pertain to blockchain. Shane and Randy, looks like, actually, it looks like we have one question that just came in from Kathy. She says she wants to know a little bit about the underlying blockchain technology, Hyperledger, Ethereum. What is Ownum actually, what type of blockchain are you currently working with?
Yeah, we use Hyperledger Fabric, but we like to say that we're blockchain agnostic in that certainly right now we're using Hyperledger Fabric, but others might want to join our blockchain with their own blockchain. We call it BYOB because we think we're funny for bring your own blockchain, because it's entirely possible that a state will set up their own blockchain system, or a bank like JP Morgan has their blockchain, and you need to be able to communicate across blockchains. So while we're using Hyperledger Fabric, we'd like to say that we're blockchain agnostic so we can work across different solution sets. I do envision a day where permissioned blockchains might become something like the intranet that we all, for those of you that are old enough, might recall when the internet first came out and was popular use in enterprise. There was the internet and the intranet, and companies always kept things on the intranet that were important to them because they didn't trust the internet. And obviously those days have passed. People put everything in the cloud and use the internet. But permissioned and permissionless blockchains are at a similar point in their maturity, in that people aren't totally confident in blockchain all the time, so they say, well, let's make it a permission network, which is fine, which is exactly what we do right now. But I envision a world 20 years from now where people will treat permissionless blockchains the same way we treat internet and the cloud today. It's just a ubiquitous thing that everybody uses and may not be aware of even when they're using it. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you for that explanation. I know Kathy just wrote thank you. We have another question from Connor. He asks, does this technology apply person-to-person sales when there are no lenders involved? And is there an existing platform or access for that?
Absolutely. Yeah, we call those casual sales. So enabling the consumer to find a willing buyer or a willing seller is a big part of what we're hoping to, or that we do enable. As for any of those people on the phone that have ever bought a car from another consumer, you know that there's always a moment where there's a bit of a standoff between the buyer and the seller, where the buyer is saying, give me the title, I'll give you the money, and the seller's saying, give me the money and I'll give you the title. And so a lot of times those transactions fail, and they wind up going through a dealer or some other third party. And of course, that third party takes a fee, thus eradicating some of the economic benefits of going for direct to consumer from another consumer. Our system would enable someone to pull up on their iPhone their title, click a button, put it basically in a purgatory state while the funds find their way into a purgatory state. A smart contract then is executed as soon as the funds are there and the title is there, and automatically both parties receive their appropriate compensation in the form of title or money. So that's exactly the way the system works. Blockchain is a perfect use case for enabling that, and that's certainly something our system does.
So how best to get a hold of the two of you and Ownum in general? Do you have a website? Do you have, can you email that? What's the best way for the participants? Actually, I got to cut myself off. We have another question that keep coming in. This question's from Christopher Touch. He says, currently I'm a consultant from North Carolina working in Shanghai, China. This platform of blockchain is already in use in China for plane tickets called WeChat Pay. How soon will United States citizens be able to put this into practical use?
Well, Ohio, Utah, and Colorado have all publicly said that they're rolling this project out. So they will be the first three, it seems, to permit enterprise, private enterprise like us to be able to send data in and out of their titling systems. There's different pace of play that each of them will roll this out, but we would expect that most of those three, probably two of the three, will have it rolled out in the next couple of quarters in some version. So we're just at the final sort of stage here with a handful of states, including the three I mentioned, and a handful behind that are all evaluating this. So, and answer your question, I would imagine sometime this year you'll start to see it rolled out, and then you'll see more and more adoption as states realize that blockchain's not the boogeyman. It works really well, and it's reliable, and if you open up data access into your systems, you can enable a lot of efficiency and cost savings for your constituents.
Okay, well, I think if anybody has any other questions, send them now. Otherwise, we can wrap up the question section. And
you would ask how to reach it. Our website is CHAMPtitles.com, so go to CHAMPtitles.com. You can also go to Ownum.io, and you see the holding company, but CHAMPtitles.com is the company we spoke about today. VitalChain.com is the birth and death certificate company if you're interested in that. And you can email Randy or I. I think we had our contact information on the screen, but it's really easy. Mine is Shane@Ownum.io, and Randy is Randy@Ownum.io. So shoot us a note if you're interested. Happy to chat at any time. Thanks for everyone's time today.
Yes, thank you, Shane. Thank you, Randy. We appreciate the great presentation, and again, we appreciate your time, and we really look forward to the future of Ownum and CHAMPtitles. And thank you on behalf of the North Carolina Blockchain Initiative, and thank you to all our participants, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Super. Thank you.